All right. Tim, on this lecture, we're going to talk about the relationship of income tax basis in the estate planning world. Typically, estate planning is dealing with estate tax and gift tax, but you do have to have some understanding of a little bit of income tax because it does come into play. And the main way it comes into play is with basis. And we've talked about this a little bit. Basis is basically what you buy something for, what you pay for an asset, what you pay for shares of stock, what you pay for a piece of real estate, what you buy a car for, your investment in the asset. And basis can change over time. If you buy a house, if you have to put more money into the house to add a room to reconstruct it because it gets burned down, those types of things increase your basis because you're putting more into the asset. Sometimes you put money into an asset and it doesn't increase your basis. Things like um, painting your house, that costs money to do that, but that's just a cost of owning a house. Your yard, you re-landscape the yard. Sometimes maybe you can add that to basis, but general yard upkeep and maintenance is no, that's just a cost of owning the asset. So sometimes there is what's called a capital improvement. You capitalize the expense, meaning you add it to basis, and sometimes you don't. It's just a cost of owning the asset. But generally speaking, if you had a house and you paid $100,000 for it, and that is your basis, and then you go to sell it for 300,000, you're selling it to an unrelated third party. Presumably, the 300,000 is your fair market value because that's what the market can get it. Then the difference between those two things is your is your technically in tax world that's called your unrealized gain. I'm sorry, your realized gain. You realize $200,000 of gain, and then there's an analysis you go through to see how much of that realized gain do you recognize, and let's assume you're going to recognize all of it, because something you would dive deeper into in your income tax class, and then you multiply it by your tax rate, and then that gives you your tax due when you sell an asset. So your basis is the starting point, the measuring stick for figuring out how much of that gain is going to be taxable. When you're alive, you keep track of your own basis. If you're going to sell an asset, you know what you bought your house for, you know what you bought your stock portfolio for, and when you make the decision to sell it, you hopefully make it realizing part of that gain is going to be, or part of that those sales proceeds are going to be taxable, and some aren't. Um, the part that's attributable to your original basis is not taxable. Sometimes you sell an asset and you realize a loss because you sell it for less than what you paid for. Right now there's kind of a season of recognizing some losses in stock portfolios because the market's down. So some people are selling assets because they need to turn the stock into cash, um, but the stock is down, so they're going to realize a loss. They're selling it for less than what they bought it for. Their fair market value on sale is less than the basis of what they paid for it. Um, and we keep up with those things with our own assets. When somebody dies, somebody's inheriting their stuff. And so the house is going somewhere, the stock portfolio is going somewhere. The basis has to go with it. And or the person receiving the asset has to know what the basis is because someday they might sell it, and they need to know: are they going to have a gain? Are they going to have a loss? And since they're not the ones that bought it, they've got to know what the former owner's basis was. Generally, and this is the part we've covered a little bit. Generally, assets that are transferred at death take a new stepped up basis in the hands of the new owner. And that is, if the house is worth 300,000 at death, then the person receiving the house under the will or under inheritance rules, intestacy rules, will take a basis equal to fair market value, that 300,000, in their hands. So now gain will only be um, realized and possibly probably recognized from date of death forward. It's like a new starting point. It's one of the very few places in tax law where you really, whereas the marital deduction, you defer the tax. You don't pay tax at the first death, you pay at the second. With the step up in basis rules, you literally get rid of the tax. The gain is just gone because the basis steps up to fair market value. So you could theoretically sell the assets on date of death when you inherit it, and you have no gain. In my example, you get 300,000 when you sell it after date of death or at date of death, and your new basis is 300,000 because the person receiving the house takes a stepped up basis equal to the fair market value of the asset at death. So you sell a house for 300,000, your basis is 300,000, you have zero gain. That doesn't happen very often, and unfortunately, you have to die to get that benefit. Um, so that's the one tax benefit you get from dying is the stepped up basis rule. All of that is wrapped up in the code, section 1014 of the code. That's the stepped up basis rule. There are times when a basis will step down. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. And almost, I think almost never or never will somebody inherit an asset with a loss. So let's say um, the taxpayer owned a house that they bought. The fair market value of the house was 300,000, and the decedent before they die, their basis is 400,000. So they they bought a house for 400,000. The fair market value is 300. They sell it. The decedent before they die has a loss of 100,000. That's a loss that has a positive tax aspect for the decedent before they die. The bad news is your house depreciated. The good news is you can maybe take a tax loss um, and reduce some of the pain of having a depreciating asset. What happens at death when this person dies? Somebody's going to receive the house. So they're going to receive a house worth 300. That house is going to transfer to a new owner with a fair market value of 300. Death doesn't change the fair market value of the asset. The person receiving the house gets a house worth 300,000. The basis is not going to move over to them at 400. This is not going to happen. This is not going to move over to them at 400. The basis is going to step down. This is about as deep as we'll get into the step down basis. The basis is going to step down to 300,000. So it goes from 4 to 3, steps down. So the person who received the house at death sells the house shortly after they receive it, and they have zero gain. What they don't get is they do not get the tax benefit of a loss that the taxpayer had the day before he died. The taxpayer could have sold that house the day before he died and had a $100,000 loss, which produces a tax benefit to him or her. That tax loss is gone forever. If you don't recover that tax loss before you die, then it's gone. Nobody. One of the things you can kind of write in your notes or just memorize. I always memorize this in tax classes. Is you cannot inherit a tax loss, and um, and and that kind of makes sense. I mean, a tax loss, the way I view it, a tax loss is meant to mitigate the downside of owning a depreciating asset. So it's going to mitigate that loss for the person who suffered the loss. If I inherit that house, I didn't suffer that loss. I'm getting a free house. I'm getting a free house worth 300,000. So I'm not going to get the higher basis with it to one, give me a free house and a tax loss. Our tax code doesn't work that way. I'm going to get the free house and I'm not going to have any gain when I sell it, but I'm not going to get the additional benefit of a tax loss. So a basis can step up or step down. Conversationally, you will always hear people talk about the stepped up basis rule, but know that there are times where it can step down as well, if an asset is in a loss position just before the decedent dies. All right. Something else you would learn in income tax class, but you kind of got to know it here too, is when you have one of these gains, um, or losses, when a decedent owns an asset and they can sell it for a gain or a loss just before their death, generally it's what's called capital gain. Um, in the income tax world, there's two main types of income that causes tax, known as ordinary income and capital gain income. Ordinary income is stuff like your wages, um, dividends off of stock, um, lottery proceeds, winnings, things like that, gambling winnings if you're in the business of gambling. Um, those are taxed at ordinary income rates, which are typically higher than capital gains rates. Capital gains um, rates typically apply to assets that are sold that you've held for investment, stocks and bonds, real estate, and investment real estate, those kind of things. Those things generate capital gain, which is taxed at a little bit lower rate. The theory behind that a little bit is the tax code wants to encourage people to buy assets and sell assets and hold things for investment. So maybe we'll let you have a little bit lower tax rate to do that, to spur on that type of activity. And then so kind of put ordinary income aside for a second. In the capital gains world, there's two types of capital gain. There's so-called long-term capital gain and short-term capital gain. And the easy part is anything over a year is long-term. And when I mean anything over a year, if you've held an asset for a year or longer and then sell it, George wants someone to play with his toy. Sorry. Um, if you've held an asset for a year or longer and then sell it, then the gain you have is long-term capital gain. You've held that investment asset for longer than a year, and you'll have long-term capital gain. Long-term capital gain is lower, and the tax rate is lower than short-term capital gain. The tax code, while they want to encourage people to buy and sell assets and keep things moving in the economy, they kind of want you to hold it for longer than a year. They don't want you just churning a bunch of stuff. So if you buy a stock portfolio or you buy a piece of real estate and it appreciates and you sell it within 1 year, then you have short-term capital gain, which is a higher tax rate. It's essentially the same as ordinary income tax rates on your wages and income. And it can be a pretty big difference. It can be close to like a 15% difference depending on what tax rate you're in. So you typically have to know the holding period of the asset that's being sold to know if you're going to have short-term capital gain or long-term capital gain. This is all talked about on page 18.3 of the white textbook. That year period is your holding period. And so when you inherit, it's easy to keep track of it when you're the person owning the asset, when you're the decedent. Have I held this asset longer than a year? When I sell it as long-term capital gain. When you inherit an asset, you got to know how long or I guess the question is, do you have to know how long the decedent owned it to know whether you're going to have long-term capital gain or short-term capital gain when you, as the inheritor, sells the asset? And the system is really designed to be user-friendly, and it just says, hey, anything you inherit is going to have a long-term holding period. You don't have to keep track with how long did the decedent own this asset. So it will all be long-term capital gain when somebody who inherits an asset then sells it later for any type of gain. But remember, you won't really have much gain immediately upon receiving the inherited asset because your basis is equal to fair market value. So your fair market value over your basis, when you subtract those two things, it's always going to be zero right at date of death. And then it will start to climb from there going forward. So that's the holding period. And really, anything included in the estate. So assets that are included in the estate, 2033, 2036, 2038, 2040, 2041, 42, 30, 2035, working with one of its companion sections. If it's included, you have estate tax consequences you got to work around. The trade-off is it now is subject to Section 1014 and gets a stepped up basis. If assets are not included in the estate, they do not get a step up in basis. I'll say that again. If assets are not included in the estate, the person receiving them as a result of the death of the decedent does not get a step up in basis. Those two things always go together. Always, always, not, yeah, I'm confident it's a true statement. Those two things always go together. And it's kind of the trade-off. The trade-off for having to include it in your estate is that the person receiving it gets a stepped up basis. If it's not included in your estate and not subject to the estate tax system, you don't get a stepped up basis. So they always work together. And so that's important because you might have a successful estate planning technique. Remember those reciprocal trusts that we drew up on the board weeks ago, where husband might set up a trust for wife, and then wife might set up a trust for husband, and those things are out of their respective estates, which can be a beneficial thing from an estate tax planning transaction. They're out of their estates. The growth on them will not be subject to estate tax when they eventually die. You save 40% on the assets. All good. The trade-off is those assets are in those trusts, and they will not get stepped up bases when each of the husband and wife die. So you will have to watch for capital gains that will be realized and recognized when those trust assets are eventually sold someday. And you just kind of have to think through that when you're helping people set things up. What's one way to mitigate that? A mitigation is when you're setting up stuff like that, when you're putting assets in a trust that you know they're not going to get a stepped up basis when the decedent dies, you typically want to put higher basis assets in the trust and keep the lower basis assets in the decedent's name, because those will be included in the decedent's estate and receive a stepped up basis at some point. Put the higher basis assets in the estate planning technique trust that's not going to be included in the estate, because those are not going to get a stepped up basis. So I want those to be higher from the get-go, because they're never going to get kind of the push up to fair market value. So that's at death. The rule is very different for assets transferred by gift, which is kind of what I just described with the reciprocal trust. Any assets transferred by gift, whether to a trust or whether to a person, are going to take a carryover basis with the asset. The decedent's basis is going to follow the asset to the new owner. So the owner receives the gift, receives a stock portfolio, receives the piece of real estate, but they also take the old historical basis of the donor, soon to be someday a decedent. And when that decedent dies, when that donor dies, becomes a decedent, because those assets are not included in his or her estate because they were gifted to somebody else many, many years ago, those assets do not get a stepped up basis. The donor just keeps owning them, as they always have, and they took the donor/decedent's basis when they got the assets. And if they want to sell them someday, then they've got to use the basis that they got with the asset to do that. So that means you kind of have to think through, if I've got somebody who's getting older, or unfortunately diagnosed with a terminal illness, do I want them gifting assets to somebody? Maybe, but part of that analysis will be, remember, whatever they gift, the recipient's going to take their historical basis with it, never to be stepped up. Whereas if we just wait a little bit longer and let the donor become a decedent because they die, and then the person who the asset's intended for receives them by inheritance versus lifetime gift, then they'll get the asset with a stepped up basis. But part of that analysis includes, if I don't give them away, am I causing an estate tax? If I don't give them away and the asset stays in the decedent's name to grow in his or her name, am I causing a bigger estate tax than necessary? If I give them away and then the decedent dies shortly thereafter, Did I cause a capital gains tax for the person who received the asset because they received it, if by gift, with a carryover basis, when if I waited just a little longer, they would have received it as an inheritance with a stepped up basis? Um, and each situation is different. It really depends on the tax laws. It depends on the size of the estate of the potential donor slash soon to be decedent. You just have to be aware and be strategic in your decision of how to get those assets to the intended recipient. You don't want to transfer low basis assets by gift the week before somebody dies, um, because they would have got them a week later with a new basis, and that's not a fun thing to have to explain to somebody. And sometimes you don't know. You don't know when the person's going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it. Um, a couple things on property with stepped up basis. Community property, page 18.8. We haven't spent a ton of time talking about community property in this class, because it's almost its own animal. You can really have a class just itself on community property. But one thing I do want you to know is, community property has this special rule. If a husband and wife own a stock portfolio as community property, they each own that stock portfolio. So when husband dies, wife now owns the whole thing. Um, she's going to get a full step up in basis on the stock portfolio in her name. Because remember, joint property doesn't pass by the will, but you still inherit it by being the surviving joint tenant of the property. Community property is a little different. It's not really joint property, it's community property, where each person is deemed to own the kind of the whole thing. And so when husband dies, wife now owns all of the community property. It will all receive a full step up in basis. She now owns the community property house, the community property stock portfolio, all with a new basis. Contrast that with joint right of survivorship property, which has we'll call it a stock portfolio. Um, and let's call it a $500,000 stock portfolio. You got husband and wife. We know under 2040, and let's say they bought the stock portfolio when it had a basis of 100,000. So it's appreciated pretty significantly. So our situation looks like this. We have a stock portfolio with a fair market value of 100. They bought it at 500,000. They bought it for 100,000. So when they're both living, if they sell that stock portfolio, what is their gain? Their gain is 400,000. They have enjoyed appreciation. If they sell it before they die, their gain is 400,000. They are each deemed to have 250 of that stock portfolio included in their respective estates under Section 2040. We know that. That's a qualified joint interest between spouses because it's joint right of survivorship property between spouses. So they each have half of the portfolio included in their estates under Section 2040. 2040 includes half. So let's say husband died. Husband died. The day after, it's really the minute after, but the day after husband dies, who owns the stock portfolio? Wife has always owned her 250, but who gets husband's 250? Well, it's joint right of survivorship. Wife does. So she now owns his 252 as well, I should say. She owns a stock portfolio worth 500,000. And that's just by the nature of what joint right of survivorship does. Um, as the surviving joint tenant, she now owns the whole thing. That's the first part of the analysis, but we have to know what is her basis. What is her basis in that stock portfolio? Because she may sell it someday. She may need the cash to now live on because maybe half their income source is now gone because he died. So she's got to know what her basis is in the stock portfolio. Um, and this requires some thought and some tracing. They bought the stock portfolio. Their original basis was 100. If she is deemed to own half, or he is deemed to own half, she's deemed to own half while they're alive, what is her basis? What is her portion of the basis of the 100, and what is his portion of the basis of the original 100? It also moves half and half. So we know that part of the basis of her stock portfolio that she now owns after death is 50. That didn't change. Her basis. She always had a basis of 50 in the stock portfolio in her half, and that didn't change. She still owns her half. Her half didn't change by virtue of his death. His half changed. So she keeps her 250 and she keeps her basis of 50. But she inherited half of the portfolio under Section 2040. Well, that's kind of a true statement. Let me say it a different way. We know that half of the portfolio was included in his estate because of 2040. We also know that when assets are included in the estate, then the basis can change under Section 1014 of the code, step up to fair market value. So because his half, his 250, was included in his estate under 2040, what do we think the basis of his half of the portfolio is? It should be fair market value under 1014. So her basis is now consists of two pieces. Her original 50 for her half of the portfolio, and the 250 for the half of the portfolio she inherited from him, which makes it a total basis of 300,000. She now has a total basis of 300,000 in the $500,000 stock portfolio. She owns 500. She always owned her 250. She got his 250. Her basis is now 300. She always had her $50,000 basis, and she inherited 250, which means the basis stepped up in 250. So she has a basis consisting of two parts, a 250 piece and a 50 piece, which is a $300,000 total basis in her $500,000 stock portfolio. And that's how joint right of survivorship property works. Very different from community property, which remember I said a minute ago, and it's on page 18.8, is the surviving owner of community property gets a basis step up in the whole thing. So if that had been community property, she would own a $500,000 stock portfolio and have a $500,000 basis, even though she didn't die. So you got to know the difference between, or just be aware that those things are handled differently. Okay, that's it. We'll see you next week. Thanks.